Welcome to Intro to Motion Graphics 2021. In this series, you'll learn everything you need to know to get started in the world of motion design. Let's do it.
TipTut.
Hello everybody and welcome back to Intro to Motion Graphics 2021. We're going to carry on with making our animation today. What we've done so far is this kind of whip stretched text effect on the intro, and today we're going to learn about motion paths and animating with realism as we add the T and O in the intro tube for this next section. So without any further ado, we'll just jump right into it. So to start off with, we need to obviously add our text. So I'm going to grab my text tool and just click and type in the word to. Now you can use whatever your font you'd like, but if you're following along, obviously you need to use Futura PT, like I mentioned before. Control, Alt, and Home will place our anchor point within the middle of our letters, and we're just going to place them over until they roughly line up with our guide layer that we used in the last episode. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm just going to swap out the fill in my character window so that we have a blue fill and no stroke. And I think the fill we used for the O was yellow, so we can just grab that from our color palette, which I moved off screen last episode, if you remember, and we can just paste that in like so. Now, this is going to have a very similar process to the previous episode. We're going to right click and pre-comp, and we'll name this one 2. And that's just going to create a composition that we can drop inside, and we can animate the 2 individually from the rest of the work. Doing it this way allows us to know that the T is currently in its perfect finishing positions. When we animate it later on, we don't have to worry about that. I'm going to right click that layer and just use create shapes from text like we did before. And we're going to leave the original layer invisible. We're also going to do the same thing we did before, which duplicate it with Control D and just separate out the T and the O onto their own layers by twirling down, selecting the ones we don't want and deleting them. Now, we're not actually going to be using this T letter shape. We're going to be rebuilding it, but we will be using the O. So I'm just going to hide the O for now because we'll work on the T first. And I'm going to reduce the opacity of this T down to 20. And I'm just going to lock the hidden text layer as well as the T and O layers because we're only using those for reference. Now, if we zoom in, we're going to grab our rectangle tool from the toolbar up here, and you can long press on that if it doesn't look like a rectangle. If it looks like a circle, long press on the circle and click the rectangle tool. Holding Alt, I'm going to click until the stroke disappears and there's just a red line through it. And we're going to check that this is the correct blue, which it is, I believe. Yes, so we can hit OK. Then I'm going to zoom in as closely as I can. And if you're having trouble seeing, you can turn the background to a checkerboard, it might help. And we're going to click and drag until we draw a rectangle that is the height and width of the full stem of our T. Going back to our selection tool, we can click that again and press Control Alt Home to ensure that the anchor point is in the middle of our shape. Okay, now we have this part of the T ready. We're going to wait until we form the crossbar until a little bit later. I'm going to choose Fit in View, and I'm going to collapse that layer with the U key, and I'm going to rename it T-Stem. Oops, or I'm going to rename it T-St apparently. T-Stem, there we go. Now, we need to draw a path for the whipping motion that we want the T to follow. So to do that, I'm just going to grab my pen tool with no layer selected. I'm going to Alt-click the fill until there's a red line through it. And then zooming out, I'm just going to draw myself a path that forms a big spiral with the pen tool by clicking and dragging and holding Shift if you want a perfect angle. By just clicking and dragging, you can use these handles to pull your shape into position. And I'm just going to finish it right beneath where our T rectangle starts. Okay, so now we just have an empty path that's in a spiral. Now, you can select these individual points by just clicking and dragging, and using the handles and dots to reposition until you get a nice smooth spiral that you're happy with. Okay, I think I want my spiral to come in like this, but it might be nice if it starts off screen. If you want to add handles to a point, you can Alt-click it, and that will give you a handle to work with, which allows you to change things like trajectory. And just tweak that until you get a spiral that you're vaguely happy with. I think I'm happy with that. Now, we are going to use something called create path from Nulls, which is a built-in script, in order to create a null object, which if you remember is just an empty object with no content that's going to follow the path of this line. And then we're going to attach our rectangle to that path. So to do that, you're going to need to go to Window and make sure that you have Create Nulls from Paths open. Selecting that will open up this window for you here. We are going to twirl down our path layer, which we will just rename to Path, until we have the keyframeable layer of the path selected, and then we're going to click Trace Path. What that's going to do is create a null object, as you can see here, and if we press U on that null object, it will bring up all the keyframes, and you'll notice that it's already created 2 keyframes for us, one at the start of the path and one at the end of the path. Now, it's already taking a second to move, which is totally fine, but we want to animate it in a cool way. At the moment, it's very linear. So what we're going to do first is attach our object. Now, go to the last keyframe of your path, and you'll notice that the null object point will line up with that last point. It's very important that you do this at this keyframe so that it aligns correctly. But you're then just going to grab your T stem, which I like to put above the path because that just makes sense to my brain. And we're going to pick whip or parent it to the trace path at that keyframe. The reason we do it at that keyframe is that then it will follow that path perfectly all the way through its animation. Okay. If, for example, you did it halfway through, when you parent, it will parent it at that point, and then obviously that looks completely incorrect. Okay, so go to the last keyframe and then parent to your path. Now, this path just has the movement, and we want it to sort of whip into position and then speed up at the end. So we're just going to start by just going to F9, select both those keyframes and drag it out. Let's see what that looks like. Not great. Yeah, kind of whips super fast in and then kind of slams into position. So we're going to definitely want to reduce the last keyframe so that it really does whip. We want it to go quite slowly until about here and then speed up quite a bit. Okay. So before we do that and before we refine this much further, we also wanted to make it look like this object is very close to the camera and then it disappears by getting, well, not disappears, it scales down by moving further away from the camera. To do that's very easy. We're just going to press Scale S on our T-stem layer and keyframe that at the open and the close. So at 0 seconds and at 1 second. And we're going to go back to the first one and we're going to just scale up. Scale up as much as you want. Then you can see it's going to start to make a little bit more sense, like so. You'll also notice that now that we have an object attached to it, we can see that it's going to loop forever, which is no good. We only want it to loop once. To do that, you go down to your trace path and twirl down everything. And then under the progress, where it says expression progress, you can just select all of that and delete it. That will allow your animation to go once and no further. Okay. 1 second seems pretty short. I'm going to Alt Shift and right until we get to 2 seconds. And automatically that gives us a lot more time to work with, which is great. I'm going to grab all of my keyframes, the scale and the progress keyframes. I'm going to hit F9 to give them an easy ease, effectively undoing what we've just done. And I'm going to find a point where I really want it to speed up, which is probably going to be about here. And then I'm going to keyframe again. So selecting these keyframes and control clicking them will just turn them back to normal keyframes, effectively undoing the speed ramping that we just did, just to test things. Then if you hit F9 on them, it will add the easy ease in and go to your graph. It should look like this. If you've got the other graph that looks like that, then you're on the speed graph and you need the, you're on the value graph and you need the speed graph. It should look like an M and a W. We essentially would like this to go fast, or rather slowing in, hovering at the top here, and then speeding up again. And with easy ease, it kind of does that, but it doesn't look great. Okay. And that's because we want it to whip into position. So we already know how to do that by just dragging to go faster, slow. Boom, boom, looks quite nice. And then this one, we want to whip fully into position and completely have no speeding out so that it really does like woof, slam into there. Maybe we can leave a little bit of it in depending on what we think. That looks nicer. Okay. So with that in mind, we've got this point where it hesitates and we really don't want it to stop. So to do that, we're going to move to the value graph. Selecting all your keyframes, go to the value graph, and you'll see that horizontal movement is no movement in this. And we can go to our scale and select that individually, and our progress and select that individually, or we can do what we usually do, which is just select both to see both. Now, if we wanted to maintain a little bit of speed, it's very simple. We just need to drag these points until they are linear, i.e. there is a level amount of motion, and you'll notice that the scale, the position hasn't been done yet, but the scale continues where the position has stopped. If we do the same thing to the position, we can get a really minute level of detail where it slows down, but it doesn't stop at all. And now, boom, looks good. However, 2 seconds, far too long. 1 second wasn't enough, 2 seconds was far too long. But I think I've got the perfect amount of time. If you notice back in our intro setting, we had at 1 second and 5 frames, bosh, it starts to jump up. That's when we want it to end, exactly. So we'll go to 2 and we'll alt drag this until it reaches there. That's going to maintain all of the easing we've just done. It's just going to speed everything up until it reaches the point we want. Boom. Okay. So it looks a bit stilted still, and that's just because at the moment we haven't really controlled it with a great amount of detail. For example, at this point, I want it to be much smaller than it is. So I'm just going to scale this down. We kind of want it to be pretty much at its finishing size. Great. The other reason is because the rotation isn't overshooting as it spins. If this object were actually rotating out like this, the back of it might spin out a little bit. So we're going to hit Shift R with our T stem layer selected to bring up the rotation keyframes. And as it whips into position here, we might add a keyframe, have it spin out slightly by just moving forward a few frames. Moving forward a few frames. And every time there's a hard corner, just overshoot the rotation ever so slightly. Boom. Especially if we keyframe here and right before we have it properly whip into position before making its way back to 0 or 90, I suppose. Boom. Now let's look at that. It's a little bit nicer. Let's also take our scale at this point, unlink it, keyframe that, and right before it slams into position, let's have it be longer because of the speed that it's moving. That looks much nicer already. I think as well, the path is a little bit extreme, or rather not extreme enough. So we're going to grab our path with the pen tool. And we're just going to tweak out to get an extra bit of spin and overshoot, you'll see there. And don't worry that it's not matching up to our original. We will fix that, because it's going to continue to spin in that direction. So really what we could do is actually have it start and finish like that. Perfect. Okay. So we have our spinning block coming in like so. And we also have the ghost layer of our teeth where we want this to finish up. So at this point, I'm just going to collapse all my layers and press U until just the keyframes come up. And then with the T stem selected, I'm going to hit Control-Shift-D to split that layer. Now, if I press U, it's actually duplicated. It's all those previous keyframes are there. But if you want to be neat, you can just delete them. We don't need them for now. Okay. Now, at this point, we've probably noticed that the line has slipped off a little bit. So I'm just going to take my path keyframe once again, where it finishes, and we're just going to reposition just so that it looks central. Just that last point, not the whole thing, just the last point. And then here, bam, perfect. Okay. So this is still linked to the path, which is great. Apart from we don't need that anymore. So I'm just going to disconnect from the trace path. And if you want to, you could also split Control-Shift-D, the null object, just so that visually in your timeline, you can see that it's we're finished with it. Now we want this to keep spinning and then drop into position. So position, definitely. Let's keyframe that. Let's have it move 15 frames. And then another 15 to go back to its original position. And in the middle, let's have it move up like so. Selecting all these keyframes, hit F9 to give them an easy ease. Go to your value editor or graph editor. Make sure you're on speed graph. And because it's just whipped out of this massive spiral, we want it to go super fast at the beginning. So we'll remove all influence from the start and add all influence to the end. Boom. Very nice. So you can already see how this might look. Pretty good. Apart from we want to have it settle into position with a smack. So we'll give loads of influence at the start and reduce some at the end. Boom. Very nice. Okay. So that is the position. That looks totally fine. Let's look at the whole thing. I think I'm happy with that. It's a bit long at the end there. Perhaps we stretched that scale a bit too much. But don't worry, we'll leave some of it, maybe 120%, because we'll be stretching this scale as it spins as well, which is actually the next step. So Shift S on that layer to increase the scale. That needs to be at 120. It's going to rotate, 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 and it's going to stop, let's say at the beginning about here. So we'll put that down to 100, 100 here. That'll make more sense when we add the rotation. Shift R with the layer selected adds a rotation keyframe. Go all the way to the end. And let's say it spins out 2 full rotations. So we click this first number here and type in 2. So 2 full rotations plus it'll have to land perfectly upright. So let's just zero that out. So now we've got the object spinning, but it's spinning in the wrong direction. It's going to flick into position here and then start spinning the wrong way. So we actually want to make sure that that is -2. So it's now going to spin dunk, and land. Looks okay, but again, now we can fix the scale once we've fixed the speed of the rotation. So we're going to grab those 2 rotation keyframes, hit F9, and you guessed it, it's going to go from super fast to super slow. I don't know if we can remove all the influence. Yeah, we should definitely remove all the influence. Bam, that looks pretty nice. Boom, 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 bosh. And the scale kind of works already. But there'll be a point if you go to your graph editor where a drastic amount of speed has been reduced, somewhere around here. And at that point, I'd say is where we want the scale to roughly end. So we'll just F9 those. Boom. Nice, very nice. Okay, so let's look at that. Boom. Looks nice. Apart from I do want it to slam down a bit harder, so I'm just going to grab those position keyframes again, and I am going to remove all of that influence because when it slams, we want it to squash and stretch to compensate. It's much easier to squash and stretch something and keep it in place if your anchor point is at the bottom of the shape. So we are once again going to split this layer, Control-Shift-D, U to bring up all the keyframes and just delete them all to make it nice and clean. Then we can move our anchor point down to the bottom of the shape. We can just grab our pan behind tool from up here in the toolbar, and holding Shift, we can just click and drag on that anchor point until we position it roughly at the bottom of the shape. From there, just some simple scale keyframes. So scale once, we'll go forward, say 10 frames. And we know we're at 100, 100. So we can just squash and stretch this to our heart's content. Go forward 10 frames. Stretch it up, making sure it's taller and thinner because we want to make it look like it's maintaining the same amount of mass. We'll have it squash and stretch just a little bit again. And then return to 100, 100, which is the shape of our original T. Hit F9 on all those keyframes. And we've got something that looks like this, which looks a bit rubbish. So again, really has to influence its scale, coming out super fast. Boom. And that looks kind of okay. But you need to remember that there's energy. So it's squash, it's going to hold at the bottom, then it's going to shoot up a little bit, and that's going to continue, but dissipating slightly each time. So you'd want to grab and add just a little bit of influence one way. Grab, add that same amount of influence back the other way. And then for the final one, you can add just a touch of influence both ways. Like so. And then that looks kind of okay like that. So let's drop back here and take a look. That looks pretty nice. Okay. So I'd say that's that part of the shape. I'm happy with it for now. I'm going to go to my last keyframe so that it's in perfect position, perfect size. And I'm just going to collapse everything like that. I will leave this with U so that I can see where my last keyframe is. And then on a new shape layer, I'm going to get myself a copy of the same blue with fill and no stroke. I'm going to come in and I'm going to trace. There's a slight upward tilt in my font. It might not be the same for you, so I'm going to add that in. I'm going to trace the outline of that T and line it up so that all the subpixeling looks fine. And that's probably close enough since it's quite small. You'll never be able to tell. And then pressing open square bracket, I'm going to position the start of this layer here, like so. Using my pan behind tool, I'm just going to link or move the rotation point up to the top left of this T part here. And we're basically going to have this part swing out of the T. So we're going to take our rotation tool, keyframe that, rotate by 90 degrees, or just enough to hide it. So 61 degrees. Move forward 10 frames. And we're going to overshoot it a little bit by just scaling that up. Undershoot it again a little bit. And then bring it back to nil. Now, you'll notice that at some point, the top of its arc, you may need to adjust its path. Just extend that so that it covers at all points. And don't worry too much about it poking out the other side because we're going to actually just trim that single frame off because it doesn't really matter. Let's grab all those and hit F9. You know the deal by now. We want it to go fast, into not so fast, into not so fast. Boing. That looks pretty good. Boing. Like so, lovely. Now at the very end, again, at the very end, we're going to pick whip that to our stem. And the reason we do this is because we're going to offset it in a moment. But first, I'm going to duplicate this layer with Control D, right click it, choose Transform, Flip Horizontal. And that's going to fill in the other end of our T here. May have to just bring it out just a little bit. Like so. So we get a perfect T. And now all we need to do is flip these rotation values, because obviously the rotation value needs to be negative 61 rather than positive 61. That needs to be positive 11 as opposed to negative 11. That needs to be negative 9 as opposed to positive 9, and 0 is 0. It doesn't matter. So now we've got two sides of the T popping out like so. And kind of doesn't matter that they flop down and reveal the top of that T. I'm happy with that. It's how it would actually be. That's fine. And now what we're going to do, because we pinned them after all the movement was finished, if we just move these back by selecting them both and choosing open square bracket, they will be scaled and connected to the movements of the T. So they too will squash and stretch with the T, which means as the T comes down and these things flip out, they're going to react and come up, which is a form of secondary motion, which looks very good. Looking at the whole thing. Nice. Let's press Tab to go up to our main composition. And we'll see how now it looks like the T boom, swings in and knocks the word intro up. Perfecto. Okay. May just tweak the beginning of these T's. See what it looks like there. That looks nicer actually a bit earlier, doesn't it? Very nice. Okay, cool. So that is the T finished, which is great. So let's move on to the O. We're going to make our O layer visible and unlock it because this is the layer that we're actually going to be doing the editing on. No sneaky duplicate shapes this time. Control-Alt-Home will place this at the center of the O, which is quite important. But because we're going to want to make this bounce, we're going to grab our pan behind tool and holding shift, we're just going to position it at the bottom of our O. So now we're going to use similar techniques for this O, but it's on a symbol. It's on a single shape, so it's much easier. We're going to grab our position. In fact, let's make it boing. Let's make it drop in at 105. So we'll just open square bracket there and keyframe our position. Let's have it take 15 frames to hit the floor. And we're just going to go back to our first frame and drag it off screen. On our second frame, it's going to hit the floor. Let's have it go 10 frames. Oh no, let's say 15. Keep things even. And have it raise up. But then there's less space for it to travel in less energy, so 10 frames should be fine. And we will just copy this original keyframe there. Another 10, or that's 20 frames, sorry, my mistake. Another 10 frames, and we'll have it come up slightly less. Another 10 frames, it hits the floor, just pasting that keyframe. Another 10 frames, it comes up slightly less. And another 10 frames, paste the keyframe. Another 10 frames, even less, and another 10 frames, paste the keyframes. Now we have a very boing, 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 rubbish looking bouncy ball. Let's grab all of those and hit F9. And we want this one to just come rocketing up in speed. So it's going to start dropping. And with gravity, obviously, it doesn't slow down as it reaches the end of its arc. So we need to make sure there's absolutely no influence there. So it's just completely speeding up. And then here, what we're probably going to do is grab both of these arcs. Maybe not 100% influence, but we'll see. Let's drag it up to, say, 85% influence either side. Or thereabouts. See what that looks like. Looks a bit weird. Boing. Boing. Yeah, that looks a bit strange. So let's drag it a touch down again. Say around 50% influence for these until it starts to slow down. Like this. Okay, that looks kind of okay. Boing. I think this needs much less than the start because it should be rocketing out. As it reaches the top of its arc, it should hover there for a bit. So we will pull this one out as well so that it hovers slightly. It's going to hover in the air. It's going to keep speeding up, which means there's going to be no influence or very little influence towards the end. Then it's going to rocket into the air. Again, at the next keyframe, it's going to hover. So we'll add a little bit of influence there. It's going to hover in there, so we don't want it to drop too fast. So we'll drag up the influence. As it drops towards the ground, there'll be barely any influence before it hits. Here, we want the same thing. We want it to be slightly faster, moving out of its influence, hanging in the air, dropping into no influence. And then the last two are so slight that you can probably just get away with it. Almost. You can see it gets a bit floaty towards the end. And that's because we haven't adjusted this influence well enough. So if you hold Alt, you can zoom in, which makes your keys a little bit easier to see. And you can see where the issue is. It slows down as it hits there. So we need to remove that influence. This influence hangs in the air as it rockets up a little bit. Boom. And then as it hits, there'll be barely any influence. So Alt again to zoom out. Very nice. So those are the position keyframes. We now need to add squash and stretch to this as it falls. So we're going to have Shift S on this layer to bring up scale. And we're going to do this in a very similar way. But we're just going to go straight ahead on this one. As it drops, you can see the dots on your line here, which make it easy to see where the speed starts to slow down. We're going to have it be unlinked scale, and we're just going to stretch the height just loads. Because at this point, you can see it's moving half the distance in a single frame. By the next frame, we're just going to squash it down and make it wider. And you'll notice that on the first keyframe, I haven't done any editing, and that's so I can just copy paste it. It's not really, because it's going to speed up as it starts to drop. It's not really going to stretch until about here, maybe here. So we'll copy this first keyframe and paste it. That means it's going to drop, stretch and hit. By about here, we'd like it to squash and stretch the other way. And you can just grab these handles and it's going to start to slow down around here. So again, we'll keyframe that, move to where we think it's reaching the apex of its arc, and we'll squash it back into a regular-ish shape. going to start to drop again and speed up, which means we need another keyframe. As it speeds up, we're going to need a few more shapes. And this isn't as extreme because it's lost a lot of its energy on the first bounce. Squash and stretch it in the other direction. As it moves back up into the air, let's go one frame further. We want to squash and stretch it the other way. It's going to start to slow down again. So we kind of want it to go back to its original shape. In fact, maybe we could even just paste it. You can see how otherwise you get a little bit of creep. You can see it scales up. So let's look at that. So we can see actually there we overscaled quite a lot. You can see that massive drop. And that is an issue with working straight ahead, is that you will get this creep, this scale creep, which is why it's good to basically check your work. I think that needs to move forward a bit. As it drops through the air here, we just want a little bit because it's lost so much energy now. We're just going to stretch it one way. It's going to hit the floor. We'll keyframe that. On the next frame, we'll just squash and stretch it the other way. It's going to rise into the air. Let's paste back the original size. And then I think we're done. Maybe on this bounce, we'll have a final tiny bit of squash and stretch. By just boing, like that. Okay, let's take a look. That looks okay. Let's see what that looks like in context by going tab back to our main and taking a look. Perfecto. Okay, one thing I did like, however, about this is that you could see through it in the original. And to do that, I literally just went to 2, the layer, went to the layer mode and just change it to multiply. And that allows you to see through. And when we add this motion block in the next episode, it's going to look even better because it kind of cuts the O in half. If I just hide these originals here, and you can see what I mean when I talk about that kind of half cut in color look there. So let's take a look at what we've done so far. Looks pretty good. Okay. Last step then is to go back inside this 2 layer and to just hide the original T like that. And there you have it. Really great shape manipulation with basic scale, rotation, position, keyframes. Really core fundamental theory behind motion graphics there is this theory of animation and weight and feeling and motion. And you get that by just taking your time, doing it one step at a time. Do the position keyframes, come back and do the scale keyframes, come back and do the rotation keyframes, etc. Have a go, see if you can't replicate this. And I look forward to the next episode where we can do some really fun stuff with masks and a little bit of expressions as well. So hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time for another episode of TipTut and Intro to Motion Graphics. Colossal thank yous to my level 2 and above members: WN62, Motion Explainer, Maybe Sharma, Ian Costello, Deshant Singe, Lone Wolf 16, Starry Tichi, Catmar, Rob V, Jason Colruddy, MPD, Missouri, Volafers, Melem, Hoover, Ralika M, Tim Fitzgerald, 2 Steps to Chill, Josh Colon, Ursula, Fermanska, The Saucier, Lally Lulelo X, Andrew Hammond, Jenna Kerry, JK Digital Creations, Jarbs Animations, Paul Jarman, and Sergio Degalado. Thank you so much, you guys. You're all beautiful people. Promise it's not a cult, but if you do click that join button below, you get access to all sorts of
Remember to subscribe for more tips, tricks, and tutorials. Thanks for watching.